A crowd fled from the place. Families escaped carrying whatever they could gather. Animals were pulled along in haste, utensils wrapped in cloth. Children lifted through clouds of dust. The sound of footsteps merged with shouts and hurried commands. No one stopped to organize. Egypt had to be left behind. The movement was chaotic. Some ran, others stumbled. Many looked back more than once. The departure happened under urgency, fear, and confusion. The path led eastward, across regions once traveled by caravans for generations, now overtaken by a multitude in flight. The first days passed quickly. The rhythm of escape sustained their advance. Camps appeared as night fell and vanished before dawn. The promise still seemed close enough to keep everyone moving. Before the gates of the promised land, when the territory could already be seen and recognized, the movement ceased. A dense light formed in the air, filling the space between the people and the land. The cloud that once moved remained fixed, thick, closing the way. The pillar of fire burned over the same point on the ground, unmoving. Men and women lifted their eyes. Silence spread among the tents. Then the voice was heard. "None of you shall enter." The light remained. Canaan still lay ahead. And there, between the visible promise and the command of God, begins the story that passes through the valley of redemption. Kadesh-Barnea was the camp on the threshold. Ahead, the land could already be seen and recognized. Behind, the desert still breathed dust, heat, and silence. The multitude had left Egypt in flight, but now they stood still, as if waiting for a permission that would not come. The path had been traveled. Even so, nothing moved. The tents stretched out in uneven rows. Men tried to impose order. Mothers held their children with the same grip of those who could still hear Egypt echoing in their ears. Moses chose 12 men, one from each tribe. They entered the land to see its paths, its cities, its settlements, its soil. The camp remained behind like a body suspended, waiting for something that should already have happened. The waiting was long. Anxiety grew alongside the hunger for certainty. 40 days passed, too long for a journey that was already near its end. When they returned, they brought the land in their hands. Heavy fruits, grapes too large for one man to carry, figs, pomegranates. The people pressed close around what was real and visible. For a moment, the camp felt that the days of wandering had ended. But the words came with the proof, and the words changed the air. Fortified cities, trained people, names that sounded like threats. The word giants cut through the crowd and made room for panic. Caleb stepped forward before fear could take hold. He spoke, calling the people to enter as if there was still time. Joshua stood beside him, holding the same direction. The multitude listened, but their hearts were already yielding. The weeping began to spread through the tents, first in clusters, then as a single sound. That camp, which had fled as a mass, began to speak as one body, and the cry moved backward, toward Egypt, as if the return were shorter than the advance. Night turned to revolt. Moses and Aaron fell with their faces to the ground. Joshua and Caleb tore their garments before the people. The thought of choosing another leader arose as a collective command, and stones began to be gathered. The tension grew as tangible as the dust beneath their feet. The promise had stood before them long enough to be grasped, and yet the camp prepared to kill those who still insisted on moving forward. It was then that the presence imposed itself. The cloud covered the place where Moses sought direction. The sound of the camp weakened, as if someone had drawn the breath out of thousands at once. Time stopped along with their voices. The decision was fixed. None of you shall enter. The camp did not break that morning. The tents remained in place, the paths still marked the sand, and the desert continued exactly as it had been. What changed was not the landscape, but the way time began to operate upon that people. The decree had already been spoken, and yet life went on. The people woke, gathered food, organized tasks, followed the signs, and rested at nightfall. No sudden rupture came. No visible collapse descended upon them. What settled was something quieter, repetition. The days began to resemble one another. The horizon stayed fixed. The roots folded back upon themselves, and though movement continued, it no longer produced real progress. They marched, dismantled, and camped again, always within the same vast, unchanging space. The promise remained alive in memory, yet no longer guided the way. Time itself had taken the leading role. Men who had left Egypt in their youth now led the lines, their bodies marked by sun and weariness. Others vanished gradually, without notice, without ceremony. The desert did not need to strike or assert itself through violence. It merely endured. The generation that had seen the plagues, crossed the sea, and refused entry began to consume itself within its own waiting, while daily life followed its relentless rhythm. Children grew within that prolonged interval. They did not know Egypt, nor did they carry the memory of chains or whips. For them, the world had always been the desert, the aligned tents, the cloud that signaled movement, the food that appeared each morning. It was not punishment. It was normality. Life was shaped within the boundary, not in contrast to it. Leadership, too, had to adapt. Moses remained at the front, but now led a people who had not lived the same deliverance he had. The instructions had to be taught with greater care, the laws repeated, the structure reinforced. The improvisation of flight gave way to an order that had to function daily. The desert began to mold habits, impose discipline, and demand endurance. To live there now required order, defined hours, assigned roles, clear responsibilities. Who marched? Who stayed? Who cared? Who watched? The people learned to sustain routine without expecting immediate change. They learned to remain without collapsing. They learned to live beneath a boundary that did not move. The decree remained active even when unspoken. It revealed itself in the simple fact that the land did not draw nearer. Each passing year reaffirmed the same closed direction. The promise still existed, but no longer matched the rhythm of that generation. For many, Canaan ceased to be an imminent expectation and became a distant inheritance, something passed on through words, not experience. Meanwhile, names vanished from the lines. Familiar faces no longer appeared in the marches. The generation that had refused entry was withdrawn, slowly, without haste, without spectacle, without return. The desert did not hasten the process, it merely sustained it. And in parallel, another generation was formed, one that had not taken part in the decision, that carried no nostalgia for Egypt, and that had grown knowing only the imposed boundary. The decree had not been revoked. It was being fulfilled through the passage of time. After the sentence, the camp fell into disarray. The night was filled with brief arguments, rash decisions, and scattered movements. By dawn, men were already moving between the tents, gathering improvised weapons, tightening straps, forming small groups without any defined command. Impulse came before direction. The commotion grew quickly. Some pointed towards the hills. Others spoke of advancing at once, as if speed could replace what had been lost. There was no formal call, no sign to justify the march, only accumulated haste. Moses tried to halt the movement. His warning was clear and direct. The presence would not go with them. The boundary remained. Even so, the advance began. Groups left the camp and climbed the nearby slopes, driven by the late conviction that the entry could still be forced. The clash was brief. The peoples of the region knew the terrain. They watched from the heights, waited for the exact moment, and struck with precision. The group that advanced without formation was scattered swiftly. There was no time for reorganization or coordinated retreat. Those who managed to return brought back the wounded, the dead, and a silence too heavy to be broken. The camp received their return without words. After that, movement ceased. Weapons were gathered up. The tents stayed closed for days. The attempt had been short enough not to become a battle, yet long enough to end any illusion of immediate reversal. From that point on, the rhythm changed. Marches took place with excessive caution, routes repeated without expectation. The impulse was gone. The error no longer needed to be spoken aloud. It was present in the way the people moved, and more profoundly, in how they avoided moving. The time of haste had ended. What remained now was endurance under consequence. The error had produced silence, but it had not removed what was already rooted. The refusal had been collective, the attempt impulsive, and the desert now held an entire people living under accumulated tension. Life went on, yet every internal decision carried excessive weight. Disputes arose over water, food, tent positions, or priority in the march. The same camp that had survived the escape began to wear itself out from within. Leadership became the natural center of that strain. Moses remained the visible reference, Aaron the name tied to the altar, and that was enough for every conflict to seek a target. Over time, the thought that others could lead better ceased to be an isolated murmur and began to take organized shape. Korah gathered influential men, familiar voices, figures capable of drawing others with them. They did not present themselves as open rebels, but as necessary correction. They spoke of equality, of justice, claiming that the whole congregation was holy. The accusation against Moses was crafted carefully. There was no reason for a center to exist when all walked under the same God. The camp listened. The proposal found fertile ground in the accumulated frustration. The sense of being stuck, of seeing the promise yet being unable to reach it, fueled a willingness to confront. The rebellion grew not from ignorance, but from exhaustion. Moses answered by marking a direct confrontation. Korah and his men were to appear with censers before the presence. It was no symbolic act. It was an open challenge. On the appointed day, the camp gathered as a tense audience. The ranks formed at a distance. No one rejoiced. Everyone waited. The ground gave way without warning. The earth opened beneath the feet of Korah and those with him, and their bodies vanished into the fissure before any reaction could form. The gap closed instantly. A cry swept through the camp, and the people drew back as if the desert itself had become unstable. The shock deepened when fire advanced and consumed part of the men holding the censers. The air grew heavy with heat and panic. People ran through the tents. Others fell to their knees. The multitude understood irreversibly that the internal rebellion had crossed a boundary that had never been meant for testing. Even so, the reaction was not immediate repentance. Fear turned quickly into accusation, and accusation again found Moses and Aaron. The crowd began to move with hostility, as though the leaders themselves had caused the destruction. At that moment, the presence imposed itself in full force. The cloud covered the camp, and a plague spread through the ranks with impossible speed. People began to fall as the movement turned to desperation. The desert filled with brief sprints, broken cries, and pleas cast into the air. Moses ordered Aaron to advance. The incense was carried into the midst of the crowd. Aaron walked among bodies, smoke, and outstretched hands until he stood precisely on the line between the living and the dead. There, the plague ceased. The camp was marked. After that day, no one needed to explain what was happening. The prolonged stay had already revealed its effects. The extended time was not mere waiting. It was sustained pressure, capable of producing rupture, defiance, and death. The journey that should have ended in days was now being paid on another scale, and the people began to realize that the delay did not exist only around them. It worked within them. The desert continued. So did the camp. The confrontation was behind them, but the strain remained alive. The desert offered no clear line between crisis and routine. Each day demanded decisions, and all of them fell upon the same man. Moses led a people who no longer reacted only from fear or sudden revolt, but from accumulated weariness. The prolonged crossing had turned simple needs into constant points of tension. Complaints returned in an unbroken rhythm. People spoke of water, direction, pace, immediate survival. There was no expectation of near resolution, only the demand for minimal functioning. The promise, once central, appeared less and less in their words. Time had shifted the people's horizon to the immediate present, and that changed their relationship with leadership. Moses absorbed it all. His body felt the weight of decades on the march. Leadership no longer relied on swift answers, but on the steady maintenance of unity. Small conflicts required direct intervention, disputes over tent space, quarrels over tasks, friction between groups. The desert drew no line between the extraordinary and the mundane. Everything demanded a response, every day. The accumulation of that weight began to show in the way Moses led. His decisions became more restrained, his silences more frequent. The man who had faced Pharaoh and crossed the sea now bore a weariness that came not from external enemies, but from within his own burden of command. The leadership remained steadfast, yet the cost began to surface. The lack of water gathered everything into a single moment. The people assembled before him with open hostility. There was no plea, only accusation. They questioned why they had been brought out of Egypt to die there. They spoke of the past as though slavery had been less cruel than uncertain endurance. Voices rose and overlapped, pressing upon him like a single unrelenting noise. Moses withdrew to seek direction. The instruction he received was clear: to speak to the rock. The act required perfect self-control, obedience under extreme pressure, restraint in place of reaction. It was not about producing water. It was about upholding authority when everything demanded release. Before the gathered multitude, that restraint failed. Moses spoke with bitterness, and the staff struck with force. The rock was struck, and water burst forth, enough for all to drink and survive. The people ran, drank, and were satisfied. The desert responded as it always had. But the act had crossed the command given. The consequence came as a direct declaration. Moses would not lead the people into the land. The leadership that had carried them through the Exodus, the crossing, and the long endurance would not step into the final promise. Nothing visibly broke that day. The structure held. The marches continued. Yet something had shifted irreversibly. From that moment on, every decision carried the weight of that future absence. Moses continued to organize the people, to judge disputes, to transmit the laws, to sustain the structure that would allow entry when the time came. The leadership was neither abandoned nor softened. It was exercised to the end, even knowing the promise would not include him. The prolonged time demanded from all, even from the one who bore the weight of command. Time passed without announcement. There was no visible marker separating beginning from end. The change came gradually, dissolved among repeated days, retraced routes. The same valleys crossed more than once. The desert neither hastened nor withdrew. It simply endured, demanding continual presence. Those who had left Egypt as adults began to disappear. At first, it was occasional. One body mourned here, another there. Then, it became frequent. Tents were dismantled to make room for absence. Names ceased to be called. Families quietly reorganized. There was no collective mourning. The process was too slow to provoke sudden grief. Children grew within this atmosphere. They had never known Egypt. They carried no memory of whips or bricks. For them, the desert was the world. They learned to pitch tents, to follow signs, to recognize routes, to await daily provision. The extraordinary had become ordinary. The manna caused no wonder. The cloud raised no question. The presence was simply part of the landscape. The difference between generations became clearer with time. The elders spoke of the past with persistence, comparing, complaining, remembering. The younger ones listened without real connection. The promise ahead carried more weight than a past they had never lived. The future outweighed memory. Leadership began to shift in almost imperceptible ways. Moses remained the figurehead, yet other names began to hold practical space. Joshua was among them, not as a declared successor, but as a constant presence. He knew the terrain, the people, the structure. He moved among the ranks without stirring tension, observing more than speaking. The years advanced. The number of those who had left Egypt dwindled until almost none remained. The generation marked by refusal was consumed by time itself. There was no mass judgment, no sudden collapse, only continuity until they were nearly gone. When the desert began to change direction, few noticed at first. The roots stopped repeating so often. Movement gained purpose. The silence that had once been heavy became attentive. Stillness began to give way to defined progression. Moses gathered the people and spoke at length. He recalled the laws, set boundaries, renewed covenants. It was not a speech of correction, but of final preparation. The generation now standing before him did not carry the same weight as the former. It had been shaped by extended time, not by the urgency of escape. The crossing of the Jordan began to take form as a tangible possibility. The land was no longer merely visible from afar. It was within reach. The desert had fulfilled its purpose, not as an alternate path, but as a formative process. Moses would not cross. He ascended the mountain, looked from afar, and there his leadership ended. The transition came without rupture. Joshua assumed command without dispute. The people organized without resistance. The entry was finally near. The time had not been lost. It had been used. The journey that could have lasted days had shaped a nation over decades. The generation that refused had vanished. The one that remained was ready. And when the first steps were taken beyond the river, there was no haste, only readiness. When the people crossed the Jordan, the passage did not feel like an improvised climax. There was no panic, no confusion. The advance took place with order, clear command, and attention to boundaries. That entry did not repeat the beginning of the story. It concluded a decision made long before. From the start, the path had never been closed by distance. The land was accessible. The route was known. The advance was possible. What halted the journey was not the desert, nor geography, nor the strength of the peoples of Canaan. It was a choice made in the face of an open promise. At Kadesh-Barnea, the people saw the land, touched its fruits, and heard the full report. Yet they turned back, not for lack of knowledge, but by deliberate decision. The command was rejected. Trust was refused. That refusal did not linger in the air. God answered with a direct decree. Each day that the land had been observed and refused became a year of waiting. The generation that chose not to enter would not set foot in the promised territory. There would be no swift correction, no emotional reversal. The choice would be sustained through time to its end. The 40 years did not arise as a side effect. They were fixed. They did not represent logistical delay or spontaneous maturity. They represented the precise duration of a decision maintained. The people had chosen not to advance in that moment. God determined how long that choice would stand. Nothing that followed was improvised. The desert ceased to be a passage and became consequence. The promise remained intact, but the access stayed closed. The generation that refused to enter remained until it vanished. There was no collective collapse, no spectacular punishment, only continuity until the decree was completely fulfilled. Moses endured the entire span, leading a story that would not end with him. He sustained the exodus, organized the endurance, delivered laws and limits, knowing he would never set foot in the land. His exclusion does not weaken the narrative. It confirms the principle. No one crosses while carrying disobedience, not even the leader. When Joshua took command, the scene was different. The generation formed in the desert carried no refusal. The entry took place because the appointed time had been fulfilled, not because the land had changed. 11 days became 40 years because a command was rejected and a response was set. The desert did not delay the promise. It executed the decree. When the decision reached its end, the way opened. The crossing begins anew only when the choice has ended.